A week ago today, the United States saw the fourth derecho of the year work across parts of Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Indiana, producing a widespread swath of damaging winds, multiple confirmed tornadoes, and large hail. Which begs the question, what is a derecho? What is the science behind it? And will we see more of them this summer? Simply put, a derecho is a widespread swath of damaging winds. The official definition is it has to contain gusts of 58 miles per hour or more. The damage swath associated with the storm must be across 400 miles, and the swath must be at least 60 miles wide. Now, often derechos will come with wind gusts much stronger than 58 miles per hour, and we saw that this past week. In fact, there were multiple cases of wind gusts of 70, 80, 90, or even 100 plus mile per hour winds. And there have actually been some cases a couple of years ago of 120 plus mile per hour winds. The question is, why do derechos have such strong winds? What's different about them than regular storms that makes them so damaging and so dangerous? If we take a look here, guys, at the instability in the atmosphere leading up to the derecho last week, it was at extreme levels. Derechos need a lot of energy to help sustain themselves, and they also need a lot of wind shear to allow these storms to tap into the instability. Instability is simply a measure of how much air in the atmosphere can move up. How fast can it move upwards in the atmosphere? How much rising air can there actually be? The more moisture there is, the more heat that there is, the easier that air is going to be able to rise and cool as it moves up in the atmosphere. That's another thing you need. You also need the air to cool as it lifts up. If air aloft is also very warm, that air from the surface will not rise as rapidly and sustain storm systems as much. So in this case, there was a lot of instability. The other thing that you need winds aloft to be moving in different directions and also at different wind speeds. When you get the differing wind speed and wind directions, it allows the storm to tilt. And when the storm tilt, what ultimately it ends up doing is after you get the initial storm to develop, the tilting nature of the storm allows for a consistent inflow of that warm, unstable air, which then allows for more storms to develop. What you often see with derechos is you'll start out with maybe one or two storms that develop, and then as you get this rising motion and this tilting of the storm, you'll continue to develop new activity as storms pull colder air at the surface. What ends up happening is you get a storm that develops, you get a lot of rain, maybe even hail that cools the surface. That cooler air then hits warmer air and allows for that air to rise. It helps to develop new storms continuously throughout the duration of the system. And so, what ends up happening is with time, storms will spread out, they will grow, and you'll get a widespread area of strong storms and damaging winds until those storms end up hidden in an environment where they can no longer tap into that unstable air. Now, typically speaking, you only get an environment like this once every 1 or 2 years across the Midwest, the Ohio Valley, and about once every year across the Southern Plains, sometimes more than one across parts of Oklahoma, Arkansas, Kansas, and Missouri. But this year, across the United States, there have already been four derechos. And in fact, there have been multiple that have hit parts of Iowa and Illinois already this year. There's a specific environment that needs to happen to get derechos. Oftentimes in the summer months, you have to get what we call a ridge of high pressure. You have to build in heat. You have to have that heat to develop the instability for these storms to thrive off of. If we take a look at what typical derecho patterns represent, you can see tends to support hotter than normal conditions across the southern and the eastern tier of the United States. And if we look at what the setup was this past Monday, you had a good bit of that, but it was a little bit different. This particular derecho was unique. It was unique because it was associated not just with instability, not just with the heat and the high pressure to the south and to the west, it was also associated with a cold front. There are two types of derechos: serial derechos and progressive derechos. The most common ones across the Midwest The Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes are progressive derechos. They form on the gradient of the instability. They tend to ride that gradient and they tend to not be associated with a low pressure system or a cold front. Serial derechos are different. They're typically associated with either a cold front or what we call a dry line, a line between very moist environment and a very dry environment. This particular derecho in mid July was actually a mix of the two. We had the instability gradient, but we also had a cold front dropping down from the north. That combination led to a pretty odd setup across parts of the Midwest, and that was reflected by what we call a bow echo. A bow echo is basically a point in the storm that tends to ride out further east than other parts of the storm. It almost looks like the shape of a backward C. Typically, with progressive derechos, ones that ride the instability gradient, you get one big bow echo that develops. But with serial derechos, you actually end up with numerous different bowing segments. Oftentimes, this also leads to an increase in tornadoes. The more bowing segments that you get, the more likely you'll get those little spin ups and multiple kind of weaker tornadoes that tend to drop down, which is exactly what happened with this past system. It was a mix of the two types of derechos. We actually had three unique bowing segments within the storm, which led to a lot of tornado reports with the system. In fact, there were 22 confirmed tornado reports in the Chicago metro area alone. Sometimes derechos can be pretty much strictly wind. But in this particular one, because of the unique nature of it, we saw numerous tornadoes, multiple wind reports over 100 miles per hour, and even some hail back in Iowa when these storms initially developed. Ultimately, the reports from this spanned more than 400 miles, meaning that it met the definition of a derecho. It's been the fourth one, or it was the fourth one of 2024. Then the question becomes, will we see more of these this summer? Taking a look at the pattern ahead, there is the potential for a more active storm pattern to develop as we close out July, but especially as we work into early August, especially across parts of the upper Midwest and the Great Lakes. While certainly nothing is certain at this distance, the pattern is there that if we can get that instability to set up just for a day again, we could see the risk of another strong storm cluster and potentially even another derecho.